Well, thank you all so much for joining, those who are virtual online and those who are here present in the room. We would like to, on the behalf of the Title IV-E program here at the UGA School of Social Work, thank Naeisha McDowell, the director of our CSEC response team in the state of Georgia, the Child Advocacy Center of Georgia, as well as Emma Hetherington. I apologize. The director of CSEC Clinic here at the University of Georgia School of Law, for joining us to present on a very important topic in honor of the National Child Abuse Prevention Month. And so we'd like to thank you all for joining us.
Hi, good morning. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties on my end, so you'll probably just be seeing Naeisha here. I'll try to get on screen if I can. My name is Emma Hetherington. I am the director of the Wilbanks Child Endangerment and Sexual Exploitation Clinic at the University of Georgia School of Law, where I'm also a clinical assistant professor. Wilbanks CSEC Clinic is the first of its kind in the nation. We represent survivors of child sexual abuse, exploitation, and trafficking in a variety of proceedings, including juvenile court, dependency proceedings, but also in civil lawsuits and post-conviction relief matters.
Awesome. And I'm Naeisha McDowell. I work with the Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia, CSEC response team, and our nonprofit supports our 52 child advocacy centers throughout the state. So anytime a child is identified as a potential victim of abuse, neglect, or witness to a crime, that child has access to a community organization called a Child Advocacy Center, where they can get therapeutic services, advocacy services. They can also receive a forensic interview where essentially that child has the opportunity to talk about what happened to them and what their experience was in a child-friendly, neutral setting where all the partners meet them there instead of the child having to go to the hospital and to the law enforcement precinct and to the social work, DFAC social work facility. All the professionals can meet the child there so they can hopefully, the goal is to have the child tell their story one time. And so our organization also oversees the statewide response to child sex trafficking. And so we assess children to see if they are, in fact, a victim or at risk of child sex trafficking. And then we work with multidisciplinary team partners such as Emma and her team to coordinate services for those youth. And so that's sort of what we do in a nutshell. But today's presentation is really just us collaborating and discussing how the multidisciplinary team works to support child sex trafficking victims, particularly victims in foster care. And so we appreciate you all joining us today.
First thing we wanted to do is to define some terms. I think that's really important when we're working with any population, but especially within this particular population. Not all human trafficking is the same. There are many different forms of human trafficking. Human trafficking is an umbrella term. It encompasses both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. I did want to point out that you'll often hear human trafficking equated with modern day slavery. That is actually not completely the same thing. Right. Slavery is a form of human trafficking. It is not all types of human trafficking. And we need to keep in mind colonial slavery and the impacts that it has had on many, many people in this country. And it is not the same. It does not come with the same type of implications as modern day slavery does. So I did want to mention that first and foremost. I always like to point that out to people. So sex trafficking involves the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. So there typically needs to be some sort of exchange there. And I'm going to further define that in a moment. And then labor trafficking, where there has to be some sort of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery. So slavery, again, is under that labor trafficking umbrella. So CSEC. What does CSEC mean? And depending on what jurisdiction or what state you live in, you might hear it in other ways. Some people call it CSET. Some people just call it CSE. But here in Georgia, we typically call it CSEC. So the commercial and sexual exploitation of a child. And there are varying definitions. There are federal definitions, there are state definitions, and the definitions vary if we're talking about an adult victim versus a child victim. So CSEC is this, again, another umbrella term They're for this range of crimes and activities that involve some sort of exchange, a commercial sex act, sexual abuse, exploitation for something of value. If it involves an adult victim, legally speaking, there needs to be an element of force, fraud, or coercion. If the victim or survivor, those terms we can use interchangeably as well, depending on what the person's preference is. I don't define for a survivor whether they're a survivor or a victim. They tell me what terms that they want to use for themselves and define themselves. So you might hear me using them interchangeably and wonder why. And a lot of times in the legal world, we do say the word victim because that is more synonymous with the definitions and work that we do on the criminal justice side versus on the more civil side or juvenile court side, you might say survivor. Again, depends on the context, depends on the survivor there. But when the victim or survivor is a child, so under the age of 18, there does not have to be any force, fraud, or coercion. If a child under the age of 18 exchanges a sex act, any kind of sex act, and this could be sexually explicit photographs. It could be an actual sex act, etc. For anything of value. Okay, so monetary benefits. When we talk about money, it can be a place to stay. It could be a meal. That is trafficking. That is CSEC. And so that's something that not a lot of people understand. And they don't understand that there doesn't have to be a trafficker. That person doesn't have to be there. And I also just included in the slides a couple of the different legal definitions that we even have within Georgia. As a lawyer, I will look at these legal definitions very closely. Sometimes I might find them to be a survivor of CSEC, but they might not fit within a legal definition. It doesn't mean that I'm going to invalidate their experience or that I'm going to say, no, you're not a survivor of CSEC, but it means that I might not be able to take action by law. And I don't know, Naeisha, if you have anything else you want to say about that under 18 piece, not having force, fraud, coercion. And
yeah, I would say as practitioners and individuals who may interact with youth who've experienced CSEC, there's this kind of common theme where people assume that when you meet these youth, they're in a place where they want help. They're ready to be rescued, quote unquote. And I think Emma and I both have feelings about the rescue recovery model that some of our agencies lean into, which it's not a problem until we start talking about the greater implications. But a lot of times those youth are in a place where they have been groomed and they have been psychologically manipulated to believe that this was their decision. And so even when you're dealing with youth under the age of 18, sometimes when they are being intercepted or they have been found, that youth may not necessarily believe that they're a victim. And so I love what you said, Emma, about really leaning on the youth in their experience and kind of how they define their experience, which can be difficult because we know as the adults and service providers that this is unsafe. And we want to make sure that this youth is no longer exposed to trafficking or CSEC, but we also have to take our time and make sure that we are slowly walking alongside that youth as they begin to understand what ultimately happened to them, because sometimes it's a lot for that youth to unpack, and we can't help them unpack it all in one day.
Right, absolutely. And I graduated from law school in 2011, and I've been representing kids in foster care, mostly age 14 and up, many or most of whom have been victims or survivors of child sex abuse or trafficking or CSEC. And I could probably count on one hand the number of kids I've worked with directly and represented in court who have said, I am a victim of trafficking, I am a victim of CSEC, or I survived this.
Right.
A lot of people might liken it, or it's very similar to dating violence, intimate partner violence type relationship.
Right.
Most of my clients will say, this is my boyfriend or my girlfriend or my partner. It kind of starts or begins in that romantic relationship. And so, for me to say to a client, no, you're wrong. That's not your boyfriend. That's your trafficker.
Right.
I mean, that is me denying their personal experience. And when we think about the principles of trauma-informed care, I mean, empowerment, choice, and voice are so important. And for me to take that away from them is just me taking more from them. Everything is me taking.
Right, exactly. And it kind of makes you question, are we any better than the people that have already exploited them in the first place? The only other thing I would add is that trafficking can look different depending on the community that you live in. And so a lot of times we'll go and do these trainings across the state, and we'll have people in like rural or suburban communities tell us like, hey, That's not happening here. Like, we don't have that trafficking. We don't have pimps here. We don't have kids walking the street or the track. And what we have to help explain to them is it could just look different depending on what your community is set up or structured. And so we have gang facilitated exploitation or trafficking, where the gang is the primary means of exploiting or trafficking that young person. A lot of times that child or youth is viewed as property of that gang in a way, or a means of bringing revenue into that particular criminal enterprise or gang.
And law enforcement and child welfare systems might see them as a member of the gang and might not even recognize them as a victim.
You had a question in the chat.
Sure.
Okay. A child who is the age of consent, 16, may be homeless and providing for themselves by prostitution. Do they qualify for legal services that you offer?
So first of all, there's no such thing as a child prostitute, and I want to emphasize that. There's a really great organization out of DC called Rights for Girls, and they have an awesome PR campaign called No Such Thing. Mm-hmm. And I would highly recommend you go to their website to learn a lot. I've learned a lot from them over the years. Legally speaking, in the state of Georgia and under federal laws, anyone under the age of 18, so doesn't matter if it's age of sex consent in the state, anyone under the age of 18 is, if they are exchanging sex for anything of value, it's not prostitution. It's trafficking victimization. And that's a really common question that we get. And part of that is because prior to 2015, a child could be charged at that age with prostitution, but not since 2015. So that's always my response is there's no such thing as a child prostitute. Children cannot legally consent to be exploited. They are not participants in their exploitation under the law. And again, so in terms of working with us, absolutely. I mean, because I would view that person as a victim or survivor of CSEC, not as a prostitute. And you also, when you see a prostitution charge, when I say that, I mean someone who's 18 or older, you also have to look really carefully at it. A lot of them, when you look at sex workers or people engaged in acts of prostitution, 70 to 90% were sexually abused when they were younger. And many of them, most of them, their exploitation began when they were under 18.
Exactly.
And so there's a big question of, is it actually, they're out of their own volition? And what you're describing is that survival sex. We would call that buyer-led.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Helps to give some language, but that was a great question. Thank you for that.
Okay, so just some other statistics. We know that there's a correlation between CSEC victimization and foster care. We don't really necessarily know which causes which, but we know we'll talk about vulnerabilities later, and there are a lot of crossover in vulnerabilities. These numbers, by the way, are probably low, just because of the rates of disclosure are low, and we know that there's a lot more. Again, the kids are not going to come up to you and say, "Hi, I'm a victim of trafficking. Please save me. Please rescue me." That's not how this works. They're going to say, "Nope, that's my boyfriend. I want to live with them. I love them. I don't want to be in foster care. I'm running away to be with them." That's what it looks like. That's the reality that we see. And so we know, though, that 3 out of 10 children in foster care, and that's of all ages, are victims of CSEC. Often they are victims of CSEC prior to coming into foster care, but they're also victimized while in foster care because the increased vulnerability of when you're in foster care. Usually the average age of entry into CSEC victimization is between 12 and 14. It doesn't mean Naeisha and I were just talking about this yesterday. Mm-hmm. Kids well under that age range are also trafficked, are also victims of CSEC. And often we don't recognize it. Our law enforcement agencies or child welfare agencies don't always recognize that as CSEC. But we know that, and there's also a big crossover between kids that are involved in the juvenile justice or delinquency system. A very high percentage have been in foster care as well and have been victims of CSEC.
And then when we look at just victims of trafficking who are in that age range of 14 to 17, about 72% of those victims are in that age range. And so a lot of times that's when we're just identifying them. Mm-hmm. Statistics and studies show that oftentimes by the time we identify a youth as a trafficking victim, they've been trafficked as early as 2 years prior to us identifying them. So it really begs the question of, are we doing enough to engage youth and identify them earlier and sooner? And so really in terms of education, when we talk about prevention and intervention services, we need to be intervening and having these conversations a lot earlier. And that's when we have to have those uncomfortable conversations about age-appropriate sexual health education, because that is a vulnerability. When a child does not understand basic sexual health, and understand their body, traffickers can manipulate that lack of knowledge to their advantage to further exploit that child. And so those are preventative efforts that we can take to go upstream and try to prevent that child ultimately being exploited. As Emma mentioned earlier, children who have experienced childhood sexual abuse, and us not realizing that we also need to tackle that issue, because there's a correlation there between childhood sexual abuse and childhood sexual exploitation or trafficking. And so we have to do a better job of also having conversations about childhood sexual abuse. We've noticed people like to talk about trafficking because it's a hot button issue right now. But when we start talking about, hey, let's talk about childhood sexual abuse. How do we prevent children from being sexually abused in their homes, in their families, in their communities? And that's when things become a little bit more taboo. But we have to have those conversations together in concert.
Right. And a conversation too, like Naeisha mentioned, it's all about developmental appropriateness.
Yes.
And so we're not talking about teaching, a 5-year-old about sex. It's about teaching 5-year-olds anatomically correct names for their body parts.
Exactly.
Knowing that it's a vagina, not your pocketbook or your pie or, other terms that you might hear people say, your hoo-ha, whatever, I mean, you hear these terms that adults will say, but it's their body parts, right? And that there's no shame about it, and that they're yours, and that they can be private to you. It can mean not saying good touch, bad touch, because that can have some really negative implications for kids. But instead, it's like be safe touch or unsafe touch. So we're kind of moving away from good touch, bad touch. But again, it's what would be considered developmentally appropriate. It's not teaching kids about sex, just FYI. So a lot of people get nervous about that, but it really does. There are a lot of studies that show, like peer-reviewed studies out there that show that this developmentally appropriate sex education for kids really can prevent sex abuse, which in turn can help prevent sex trafficking.
Exactly. I have a question. Yes. Specifically, when we talk about indicators with more so adolescents, regardless of age of boyfriend, that having an adult boyfriend is definitely a true indicator. But what questions are appropriate to ask them once they start engaging in sexual activity to kind of lessen this time frame between your teen being notified? What are some of those important questions to ask teens when they start engaging in sexual activity?
That's a great question.
That's a great question. I from my perspective, I think a lot of it also depends on the rapport. Because if I'm a teenager that doesn't know you from a can of paint, I'm not going to tell you the truth. I think back to when I was a young person. If I'm sexually involved with someone and I don't trust you and trust that you're not just going to rat on me or go tell my parents, I'm probably not going to tell you the truth. And Emma's going to talk about harm reduction later, because a part of having that conversation is harm reduction. Like we know you're going to engage in this behavior. If a child is sexually active, they're already engaged in that behavior. So how do we make sure that they're doing it safely or as safely as possible? And so a lot of that depends on rapport. How good of a relationship do you have with this young person? And are they telling you the truth about the sexual acts that they're engaging in? Because if the child is just telling you, oh, well, we're just kissing, but they're not telling you there's actual intercourse, they're not telling you, maybe there's oral involved, they're not telling you those things, then you can't really fully help them. You can't talk about contraception and the use of condoms and things like that, because in your mind you're like, oh, they're just kissing. We can talk about it, but now we got to talk about, like, how do you use that? If you're in a situation where the person says no to a condom, like, let's walk through that. How are you going to respond to that question? And that young person has to be able to trust that safe adult to know that if maybe they don't say the right thing, they won't be penalized for it. Yeah. But it'll be a conversation around, okay, well, here's what may be helpful. Tell me what you think about that. Let's try it. Let's try it out. Like, you pretend that I'm your partner and you need to say that. So that youth can get comfortable, because a lot of times youth don't disclose things or share certain things because they feel like the conversation is awkward, and so they go into situations not being fully equipped to have hard conversations, whether it's with a safe adult or with the person that they're sexually active with. And so a lot of times I think that relationship is kind of the baseline.
Right. I mean, it's awkward for adults too. Just like teenagers about it. And as a lawyer, I get so when I am representing a child in this context, I am their attorney. I'm not their guardian ad litem. My job is not to tell the court what I think is in their best interest. My job is to advocate for what that child wants. Mm-hmm. The rules of confidentiality that I have with an adult also apply to my child clients. Mm-hmm. And they're pretty strict. And so my clients, I always tell you, one of the things I'll tell them is something like, if you told me that you stole a bunch of candy from Target yesterday, I can't tell anyone. Mm-hmm. I can't tell a soul. Mm-hmm. I can't report it to police. I don't report to defects. That also extends to if you tell me that, but I can take protective action under certain circumstances, but I'd be very, very careful with what I can and can't disclose. Mm-hmm. So I hear a lot of things that other professionals might not hear, but I'm also a lawyer. So what Naeisha's talking about, I have to think about what my relationship is like with my clients. And I have to build a lot of trust with my clients. So they know I'm not going to rat them out. They know that. They'll go, well, I'm going to tell you. I love it. They'll go, I'm going to tell you, Miss Emma, because I know you can't tell anyone or you're going to lose your law license. That's what it is. You're right. You're right. Like, you're smart. You are correct. I don't want to lose my law license. And they know that there are certain circumstances under which I may report things, but I still don't have to. And so I can build that trust. But as a lawyer and as their lawyer, am I the person to talk to them about condom use? Has it happened? Sure. Mm-hmm. Have I had clients say, Emma, can you go buy me a pregnancy test? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've done that. Yeah. I mean, those are things because I have that duty of confidentiality. So I have that role. I can build that trust in a way that other professionals may not be able to. But also they know that I'm not judging them. Mm-hmm. And so one of the questions that you asked was, part of the question was, what kind of questions? I was asked non-judgmental, open-ended questions. Mm-hmm. I make zero assumptions, right? When a child talks to me about it and says they're having sex, I don't respond with facial expressions. Mm-hmm. I don't tell them that's bad. I don't tell them that they shouldn't be doing that. It's not my place to judge them. It's my place to listen. And I try to engage in active listening. Neutral face, neutral tone. And sometimes kids will push me. They'll try. They will try to shock me. I'm like, you're not going to shock me. I'm not going to let you. And sometimes they do, but I don't let it show. Okay. And I accept it. And it's amazing. They look at you like, oh, okay, I really can talk to you about these things. And you're not going to judge me. And you're not going to tell me I'm a bad person for these things. In terms of safety with those conversations too, I mean, I am also going to gauge, and I'll kind of dip my tone a little bit. So they'll tell me, I'm like, oh yeah, so tell me, you mentioned this new boyfriend. Like, tell me about him. Where'd you meet him? Mm-hmm. Just like normal questions I might ask one of my friends. So if I'm sitting with Naeisha, where'd you meet your new boyfriend? Tell me more about him. Like, where does he live? What does he do? Where does he go to school? Starting to ask those questions where I can gauge the appropriateness of the relationship. Right. One thing I always tell people, especially when we're talking adolescence, is teenagers have sex and that's normal child development. Right. And so a lot of times people will freak out and be like, oh no, we have to stop them from doing all of this. This is what's causing the trafficking. And no, that's not what's causing the trafficking. I need to make sure, like Naeisha said, is this a safe situation and how can I make them more safe? Mm-hmm. If it's not completely safe, is it age appropriate? If my client's over 16 and it's a 19-year-old boyfriend, that's legal. Mm-hmm. But what's the nature of their relationship? And I always kind of use it I always try to also ask them questions, again, sort of I'm not like making jokes, but using a friendly tone of like, so tell me, how's he treating you? Mm-hmm. Is he treating you okay? Because you tell me if he's not treating you okay, because I'm going to step in there for you. Yeah. Kind of doing that sort of thing to just gauge a little bit. And then they'll open up some and they'll tell me a little bit more. And then I go do my little research on the side. Exactly. Like, let me look him up on social media. Who is this kid or who is this adult or whatever else? Do a criminal background check if I can. But again, just going back to those questions about just non-judgmental, open-ended, try to have a natural conversation with it and not make them feel like they're being grilled. Exactly. Or that they're being cross-examined. I don't want to do that. Yeah.
Good question. Thank you. So the next couple of slides will be related to data. And I'll say this, take all of this with a grain of salt. If anyone tells you that they have perfect statistics related to trafficking, they're lying. But you all are social workers and statisticians and all the things. So you know that. But this is data from Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia. This is our statewide data that we collect And so in 2024, we just wanted to illustrate the referral progression. So we accept referrals two ways: through our hotline, it's a 24/7 hotline, and through our HIPAA compliant web referral form. And so anytime we receive a referral, we're of course collecting that information, logging it in a statewide data system that we keep. So last year we received 198 hotline calls and we received 670 referrals. All of those hotline calls transferred to actual referrals because we use that form to just collect all the data pertaining to that young person. And so as you can see here, this is our referral progression across the year. And you see we had a huge spike in October of 2024. And a lot of that, we're still trying to figure out why there was such a spike. Our suspicions are before the holidays, folks like to go ahead and make sure kids are on someone's radar, because a lot of times we'll also have children, because of what they're going through, because of their experiences, they may leave their homes without permission around holiday times. We all know how stressful that can be. And so a lot of times we have practitioners, providers making referrals during that time to just make sure that the child is on someone's radar in the event that they leave care or they go missing. And so I wanted to point that out as well. And a lot of times with referrals, we're receiving referrals on youth that are already intersecting with some system. And so that's why Emma said earlier that these numbers are underreported, because these are youth who have come across the radar of DFACS, child welfare, social workers, therapists, law enforcement, Department of Juvenile Justice. Their parents have the resources and the knowledge to make referrals. Absolutely, school social workers as well. And so these are referrals that are primarily coming from professionals in the field who can identify these youth as at risk or potential trafficking victims. So that's why I wanted to say, take these statistics with a grain of salt. This does not capture, I'm sure, the very high number of youth who don't have any safe adults or caregivers that can even spot them and recommend them for services.
I wonder, I was just Googling over here if there was anything that came out in the news in October 24.
Yeah.
Because that's also another time when we'll see those spikes. It's not,
Exactly.
I mean, there's like the Super Bowl and things like that. But in October 24, I was thinking, what was going on in the news? I don't know the answer to that.
Good
but
point.
I was just wondering what's happening.
Yeah. No,
Or what report came out or something like that.
And sometimes it's a matter of, we'll do a big training in a community, and within 2 weeks, we'll start to see referrals from that community, because now people know what to look for. And that's just anecdotally across the board. We have seen within about a month, 2 weeks to a month of doing a large scale training in a particular community, we'll see a spike in referrals, because now people are like, oh, I think I know what I'm seeing here. I need to go ahead and get this on their radar. So this just shows you the 2020 referrals by legal county. And so we share this to just help illustrate that it's not a primarily Atlanta issue that we're looking at here. In terms of the types of we see rural, suburban counties and cities that are also having sort of an issue with exploitation. But I'll say this, the counties that you see listed here, Fulton, of course, is number one. Fulton County has an abundance, some will say, of resources that are concentrated in that area for trafficking victims. Fulton County is in DeKalb, and some of our metro counties are being inundated with trafficking trainings, resources, and so they typically know what to look for. They're also huge counties. They have millions of people within a geographic area, so of course their numbers are going to look a little different.
They weren't number one a few years ago, right?
They were not. It was actually, I believe, Richmond County was number one.
And Chatham, I think, was higher up previously.
Yeah, they fluctuate, but I would say the numbers fluctuate between Fulton, DeKalb, Cobb, Gwinnett, and Richmond. Chatham is now starting to get on the radar as a higher, having a higher referral rate as well. And then you see Clayton, Douglas, Henry, and Paulding sort of emerging as hot spots as well. But those first 5 counties are absolute hot spots for our team in terms of areas where we know a large number of referrals are going to come out of those areas.
Are these referrals or also confirmation?
These are referrals. Yeah. Any questions about any of that? Okay. All right, so just to provide a scope of where we're getting referrals, and I'm sorry that's a little blurry. Sometimes it shows up clear, sometimes it doesn't. But this is just a map that kind of shows all the counties where we received referrals in 2024. And so the areas that have sort of that darker blue color, those are areas that receive 40 or more referrals. The areas that are in that lighter green, that was 1 to 19 referrals, and then the lighter blue is 20 to 39 referrals. And then, as you can see here, the top 5 referral counties for 2024 were Fulton, DeKalb, Cobb, Gwinnett, and Richmond counties. Now, again, we like to iterate that these are counties that are making a lot of referrals. It does not necessarily mean that they have the highest number of CSEC victimization. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have the highest number of suspected or high-risk youth. It just means that these professionals in these communities probably have more resources, more training, more knowledge on the issue of CSEC, and they're making more referrals, which leads to us being able to identify more children as victims.
Yeah, and we've also seen, just because of the high turnover rate, for example, of DFACS and our child welfare agency, that because of that, when you have a new batch of case managers coming in, they might not have the training and know who to call. They may not understand the definition. The question we had before of a 16-year-old engaging in sex for exchange of something, of a place to stay or a meal or something, if people don't understand, that is CSEC.
Yeah.
They don't make those referrals. So we'll hear that a lot from some of the counties that even don't have any referrals on there. I'm not going to name them out loud, of course, but I'm seeing some of those and thinking, no, I know they should have made some referrals out of there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the goal is that we want to be able to identify youth across the state. No one is trying to make CSEC or child sex trafficking an Atlanta issue. We just want people to understand that it is happening in your community, whether you realize it or not. And the more you know, the more knowledge and resources that you have, the better able you are to identify it and ensure that those youth are connected with the proper providers. And so we received last year referrals from 101 rural and urban counties in Georgia. And this really just underscores the widespread and systemic nature of this issue across our state, because there's a common misconception that this is only an Atlanta issue. That's just happening up there in Atlanta. Nobody has that issue down here in South Georgia or West Georgia. We don't deal with trafficking, and we have to tell them it just may look a little different from the way it looks in Atlanta.
Yeah, I mean, I came across a case just last week where I was asked about some kids that were 5, 6 years old.
Yep.
And it was not referred. And I said, y'all need to refer this case. This is CSEC. I said, but they're so young. I said, nope, it's still CSEC. This is it. And yeah, I guarantee if your community has a high rate of poverty, high rate of drug use, opioid use, things like that, I guarantee you there is CSEC in your community. It's guaranteed. It's just, are you catching it? Are you recognizing it, identifying it? Absolutely. And it is hard to identify. That's not, any judgment on people not catching it. It is hard to identify. It is. It absolutely is. Which is why you refer it and let the professionals like Naeisha's team do the assessments and determine whether or not it is.
And we appreciate that. And so, speaking of assessments, this is just a quick overview of the assessment process that we take. This assessment, we call it comprehensive because Emma said it earlier. A large percentage of youth that we interact with or come across are not going to tell you, upon first meeting them, hey, I'm a trafficking victim, or raise their hand and volunteer to receive help. And so we take a comprehensive approach. The first thing that happens is someone makes a referral. They call the hotline, they make a web referral, they reach out to us individually, and we get them connected with our intake manager. They receive the referral, and then they, based on the region that the referral is coming from, they'll disseminate that referral to a regional care coordinator. So we have 15 team members, and we have a number of regional care coordinators that work in North Georgia, South Georgia, East, West, and Metro Atlanta. And they are physically located in the areas that they work in, which helps with relationship building and just making sure that they can provide support in those areas. So we're not a team that's concentrated in one particular area. And so that referral will be assigned to whoever's in the regional area that youth is coming out of. Once that regional care coordinator receives the referral, they're going to work with the referral source, whether that's a parent or a multidisciplinary team partner. And when we say multidisciplinary team or MDT, we're talking about anyone that falls in sort of that unit of services for that child. So that could be law enforcement, medical, mental health. That can be from the legal side. Those are the individuals that are coordinating to make sure that that child receives the services that they need and deserve. And so our regional care coordinator will work with that partner or referral source to gather additional information. We're big on history gathering because, as Emma mentioned earlier, a lot of times these youth have a prior abuse history, a prior neglect history that will help kind of paint the picture as to why they're now being victimized by a trafficker or exploiter. Once they collect that information, we do use a screening tool called the Commercial Sexual Exploitation Identification Tool, and it's a screening tool. It is a screening tool that's been validated, and it's out of West Coast Children's Clinic in California, and we use that tool to basically inform what are some of the risk factors and indicators for trafficking. And again, history gathering is paramount. Once that regional has a good set of information, we're typically trying to move that child forward to a forensic interview, because again, we're big on, let's hear the child side of this. What's their take? What's their experience? This may not have been a one-time thing, which often it's not. A lot of times our children have been trafficked across multiple counties, cities, jurisdictions. And so we have to make sure that we're also focusing on what have some of their other experiences been. And so the child is eligible to receive a forensic interview at a child advocacy center. And then what we'll do is, of course, prioritize medical services, because they will need like a sexual assault exam as well if they consent to that. But we do prioritize them just getting that sort of emergency contraception, sexual assault exam, all of those things. Now, it'll be the totality of all of that information that we use to determine if that child is a CSEC victim or if their victimization is what we consider undetermined. Because sometimes we don't have enough information, and we take it very seriously, that label, because we know that if we label a child as a CSEC victim, they're now eligible for a CSEC placement. And if that label is not in the hands of the right professionals or someone who doesn't understand that fully, that child can kind of just be tossed into services that may not be appropriate for what they've experienced. And we can talk about placement, because there's a lot of thoughts about placement for CSEC victims that
We're about to come in hot on this.
we are going to come in hot on this one. So once that child is confirmed or identified, that's when we move towards coordinating services for them, really based on what that child needs and what they've identified, and then what the child wants. Every kid's not wanting therapy. I'll be honest with you, especially talk therapy. Some kids need equine therapy. Some kids need just a mentor that can just walk alongside them. Not every child is screaming, hey, I want therapy. And we have to respect that. And then there's not a one size fits all to services. We don't have a one size fits all approach. Every kid's going to look.
Oh, they shouldn't all have trauma-focused CBT?
Well, people think that, but we all have different
That's not good for them.
and every kid doesn't want that. So we have to respect
But then they're not compliant with their therapeutic services.
And that's when we have to have conversations about, okay, are we being trauma-informed, but we're focusing on where the client is. So
Not compliant.
as you can see, we've seen a lot, as I'm sure you all have as well.
Yes. I want to revisit a discussion we had earlier before the webinar on what the response team, with the response in the response team, right? So there's this kind of thought that with the response team, they'll come out, get their DFAS, and immediately provide this intervention on site for these. Could you kind of I know you went through the assessment process, but whether or not they're in school or in a medical setting and a referral is made, and what the expectation should be as a response to the response team?
Oh, it evolves. It depends on the day. There are days where we're at the hospital or at a juvenile detention facility. There are days we're not. Sometimes, a lot of times, by the time we get a referral, again, this child is already involved with the system most of the time. They're either already involved with DFAGs or they're already involved with the juvenile justice community, whether that's a juvenile court or DJJ, which is Department of Juvenile Justice, or they already have some type of law enforcement involvement. And so by the time we get involved, things are already moving for that youth. And so, and that's a good chunk of the time, not all the time. Sometimes these kids have flown under our radar. We've never seen or heard of them before. And so once we get involved, it really just depends on what the needs are. There are some times where a kid is sitting at the hospital and there's no safe adult there. And so our team will fill in that gap. Or there are times where DFACS is there, law enforcement is there. There's like 5 people at the hospital with the kid. We'll stay out of it. And so it really just depends on what the needs are. We also have child advocacy centers. And so when a kid it goes to a child advocacy center. The professionals there also have training to support that youth on site while they're at the CAC. And so our team is really focused on the assessment piece, convening the multidisciplinary team partners, kind of herding all the cats that are involved with the child's case, because it is a lot. And again, we specialize. All we do every day is CSEC. DFACS case managers are doing CSEC, abuse, physical, sexual abuse, neglect. They're expected to carry it all. And so...
And they can't.
And they can't possibly. It is. It's very difficult. And so we fill in the gap because we just have a level of knowledge on CSEC that the average person is not necessarily going to have, even average professional, because they're just not seeing it and working in it every day. So we're coming in. Exactly. Because we're statewide, the child's placed in North Georgia and then they move them down to Lowndes County in South Georgia. We can still provide support to that young person. So our response piece is coming in to provide that assessment. Sometimes we need to do an emergency assessment because the child needs placement right away. And there's enough information to suggest that their experience is consistent with CSED. Sometimes it's a matter of, well, this child needs an advocate, someone to just really be a support for them because no one else is able to really get through. Our team can provide that support. A lot of times we have to provide education in the moment to this case manager who's confused as to why this child left home without permission. Again, this is the 5th time this week. Somebody help me. And we're having to say, actually, this is kind of normal. It's to be expected, and help this case manager understand I'm not crazy for being very just burnt out and confused as to why I can't find a place for this child to just stay put, and helping them understand this is a trauma response. This is not the kid just wanting to make your life harder. And so those are things that our team is helping provide. We really just fill in those gaps to support the MDT. That's a lot of what we're doing, is supporting the multidisciplinary team that supports that child. And then when helping pull the pieces together for the assessment and ultimately services for that young person.
Yeah, and I cannot help but emphasize the importance of the MDT. I mean, the MDT approach is an evidence-based approach. It is the most recommended approach for a number of reasons. And that is because one agency, one organization, one person can't do all of this. We cannot do the response by ourselves or even within a singular organization. And there are a number of reasons for that, right? Like, you need different types of professionals. You mentioned education and medical and psychological and therapeutic. These kids, they did not just pop into existence the first time the MDT or a single member of the MDT met them. They had a whole life before, like Naeisha was saying, that history. And when we bring together different types of professionals, we are able then to better look at a child's life objectively, right, holistically, from those different viewpoints, to gather those different pieces of information and from those different viewpoints and areas of expertise. I mean, when we say response, we're not saying we're going to go and rescue a kid with the GBI and bust down some doors. And maybe that's part of the response.
That's somebody's job.
Yeah, no, and maybe that's part of the response at some point. Most of the time, it's not, though.
No.
Most of the time, these kids are getting arrested. They're not getting saved. They're not getting rescued. We're arresting them. We're criminalizing them. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to emphasize that. Like, most of the time, we're getting these reports later.
Yeah.
Not in the middle of their exploitation or trafficking victimization. That's not when we're getting these reports. And like we were talking about before, the kids aren't coming to us and saying, this happened to me. So you have to look at it holistically. And also with the See It tool, the assessment tool Naeisha mentioned, for it to be a valid tool, you have to be trained to use it. So I am not trained to use the See It. Can I find it online and Google and find it online and fill it out myself? Sure. Have I been doing this work for 14 years now? Yes. But if I fill out that tool, it's not valid. It's absolutely not. Just like if I try to do a forensic interview, it's not valid. It's not valid and it's not appropriate. I need to refer to the professionals in those areas in my MDT, and I need to trust them. I need to trust my team, and then we can all come together to actually help the kids.
Absolutely. You have a question?
Yeah, thank you. So still thinking about this pattern, I'm thinking of integration. Yes. In our work, so our the Center of Being and Transfer Papers is such an outreach here. Yeah. And one thing that you observe in one of our projects in West Africa is that survivors are not from that country, they're from a different country. And this mentioned about providing sound safety and over. This is to what extent those referrals, the referrals that you receive needs, like, are they from, like, are some of them from immigrants? And are there special services that are tailored to working with that specific group? Like, given that the experience is pretty different from someone who's of age.
Right. Thank you for the webinar. That's working.
Sure, absolutely. So her question was about referrals for immigrants and making sure that are there specialized services for immigrant minors that may be experiencing trafficking or their suspected trafficking, maybe even labor or sex trafficking that coexist, and just seeing what special provisions or services are available for those young people.
Yeah, and I would say the answer is yes and no about availability. Yes, as under the law as it currently stands, we should be providing culturally responsive services to children who may be immigrants that we're identifying as possible survivors of CSEC. And if you think about it, especially in the context where Nation are working, if we're working with kids that are primarily within the foster care system, within the juvenile justice system, a lot of times these are kids that are separated right from families. This isn't their country of origin. Right. We don't speak their first languages, and we don't. I mean, we have clients that are from other countries, and one of the big things for them is food. Right? They just want food that's their home cooking, that's their comfort food, and it's so huge. And so, number one is under the law, under Georgia law in particular. If a child is in foster care, DFACS has to be making reasonable efforts to achieve permanency for these kids. And reasonable efforts are defined as different types of services. And one of them would be culturally appropriate placement services, things like that. There are also some federal laws and regulation on that, although I won't go into it. We did have a recent case that stayed some of our federal regulations on that. So TBD on where those are going. But we do still have good law in the books. I always refer to immigration attorneys. If that's an issue that comes up, I'm not an immigration attorney. So, for example, we have a community health clinic at the law school, and I'll go down the hall and I'll talk to my colleagues down there. And even if they can't take a case, they can help refer to an immigration attorney to handle those issues. If you're not sure, refer to those professionals that are in that area to see what needs to happen. So if we need to get special immigrant juvenile status for the kids in order to get some services, if we need to get letters in order to get healthcare, if we need, so they're different options. In terms of services, it depends on where you live as well. I mean, having therapy in your native language can be really, really difficult. Getting interpreters set up. Anything that has an ounce of federal funding, it's a civil rights violation not to provide those public accommodations or those services not in their native languages, unless it's. There are some circumstances where it might not be required, but it typically is. So, whether do we need an interpreter for therapy? Like, get creative with it. Another thing that we'll do is for our clients, I'm just using food as an example. Like, we ask, what are those foods that you love? And we go and we bring them with us to visits. We'll say, we'll go do that. If we have a client that's about to turn 15 and a quinceanera is really important to them, we're going to advocate, to get them that party. Because it's so important culturally for them. We'll also look within the community. A lot of times there are community organizers and leaders who you may not be aware of. Yes. Right? So just looking within your community outside of your own bubble to see, are there mentors or community organizers or programs that might not be 501c3s, but are safe and wonderful and can provide those cultural connections for kids.
Absolutely. I would say about 10% of the referrals that we receive are for youth that are foreign national or immigrants. And so, and that shouldn't be the case. It should be a lot higher. And I think the part of that we struggle with is there has to be trust in that community to know that if I make this referral, if I reach out for help, I won't be, deported. I won't have legal, harsher legal implications or go to jail or whatever the case is. And so there's a lot of fear in some of our immigrant communities to even speak out about these things. And then there isn't always the knowledge to know, like, hey, there are resources available if someone, your child, you, or someone in your community is experiencing trafficking or any other crime. And so we got to do a better job as a state with that. We aren't where we should be. I'll say that.
This may have a question to Jack. Okay. Dr. Tamara Noel asks, it sounds like a directory of therapists of different languages and cultures could be helpful. Is this something that exists?
So currently we work with one of the child advocacy centers that falls under our umbrella, the Georgia Center for Child Advocacy. They have a project called Project Intersect, and they have a database of TFCBT trained therapists and that's trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy. They are trained to work specifically with CSEC victims. And they have an array of therapists. Some of them have different ethnic backgrounds, speak different languages. And so that is one database. But I don't know off the top of my head outside of that database if one specifically for victims of crime or specifically CSEC exists outside of that Project Intersect database.
I mean, it would be very helpful if someone wants to take on that project. I think another problem that we have, especially within the child welfare system, is because of funding streams, because of the requirements, for example, in our Families First, in terms of what kind of services that we have, is they need to be evidence-based or on some of the clearinghouses, the Child Authority Clearinghouse, for example, being an evidence-based practice. The problem we come across there is, okay, trauma-focused CBT, fine, we can have that. But that might not be a culturally responsive therapeutic service for certain kids. Yeah. So if we look at, for example, First Peoples, American Indian children, and cultures, their therapeutic services are going to look a lot different. The difference is they may not have had the funding and the ability to make it evidence-based. It's expensive. And there's been a focus on Western interventions, more your Western European type interventions more so than anything else, as opposed to culturally responsive therapeutic services. So then there's that funding question, but that's again why I would defer to community leaders and organizers and people like that and learn about it. We have benefit being here at UGA, but I've worked with experts from different departments, learning more about some more culturally responsive approaches and working with my clients. And whatever I can advocate for, I will in court, but I have to educate myself because I don't understand another person's experience or where they're from. And so just again, really looking beyond what we might, in sort of the like traditional Western world of therapy services, right? We need to look well beyond what we typically think of as evidence-based or appropriate.
Yeah.
Agreed. And a lot of our kids receive Medicaid. And so some of the therapy providers don't necessarily accept Medicaid because they have costs and needs as well. And so that gets tricky as well, to where kids can't necessarily get the level of care or therapeutic services that they need and may have to go somewhere that is already overcrowded and there's not maybe enough space to accept that child. So that's just another tidbit to think about as well. I just wanted to briefly go over the different assessment outcomes that we make once we have assessed the child. We have high risk, confirmed, and undetermined. So as I said before, confirmed is when we've identified that this child's experiences are consistent with the OJJDP, Office of Juvenile Justice Prevention, their definition of CSEC. And then high risk is more so, it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck. We're pretty sure that this child probably has had some type of experience that puts them in line with the definition of CSEC, but it's not definitive. And we don't want to move forward with confirming this child and it puts them in a situation where they then eventually become a victim. And we'll talk about that. And then undetermined is there just isn't enough information to say that this child's experiences are definitely consistent with the definition of CSEC. But that does not mean that if a child is undetermined in July, that in August they won't be confirmed. It just means that after we completed the assessment based on the information that was gathered at that time, this was the outcome. And so we just wanted to provide you all with some language in terms of what happens after an assessment decision has been made. If a child is high risk or undetermined, we will still make referrals out to other service providers. Sometimes when the capacity is there, we'll even keep that child on our caseload, and the MDT will continue to work on staffing that child's case to see, hey, are there new developments? Are there new risk factors? Do we need to consider other service opportunities so that maybe we can prevent this child from ultimately becoming a victim of trafficking?
And I really appreciate that about the work that your team does, because the label of CSEC, I really hate when people will say, this is a CSEC child. What does that even mean?
Right.
Yeah. It doesn't define them. It doesn't define their whole experience.
Yeah.
It doesn't, define their core being and who they are. And it can be really harmful to have that label, especially when we talk about placements and things like that. There's this belief of, okay, if they're CSEC, they need to fit in this box of services and this is what they need. They're still individuals, right? Each child has a different experience, they have different needs, all of that. And so I appreciate, again, this is a great reason why you have trained professionals doing these assessments like Naeisha's team, because I don't want to give that label, just because. You be real careful with it, right? And just because they don't have that quote unquote label, again, doesn't mean they don't need certain services. So we also don't want, on the other edge of it, you don't want them to be blocked out of things. But you have to be careful on both sides of it with the labeling of it, and just know, like Naeisha said, it just kind of, it means certain things, but it doesn't always mean, yes, they're definitely a victim, or no, they're absolutely not.
Right. Thank you for that. It's tricky. Just to help you understand for confirmed youth. So in 2024, we served a total of 804 youth across our network of child advocacy centers and our team that responds to child trafficking. And so those are kids that were referred to us from previous years. So that's not just kids that were referred in 2024. We still have kids on our caseload from 2020, frankly. And so we're still working with those youth and working with the multidisciplinary team partners. We did, however, complete 518 assessments statewide in 2024. And out of those assessments, we were able to confirm or identify 360 children as victims of child trafficking based on the definition of CSEC that Emma provided you all earlier.
I wanted to make a quick note on this. Yeah. So this, not the 2024 numbers, but so the last child maltreatment report we had from the Administration of Children and Families said that out of Georgia in 2022, there were only 42 kids that were confirmed. That is not the data that is the most reliable. It would be the CSEC MDT. And again, it's because they are trained in this assessment. They are specialized in this assessment. They have that capability. Also, and I think your numbers for CSEJ's numbers for that year was around like 180. Mm-hmm. So 180s confirmed versus 42 confirmed. That means there's a gap. Right. So I think one of the gaps there is under Georgia law, if you are law enforcement, if you work for a child welfare agency, if you work for DPACS, either one, you have to report or make a referral to the CSEC response team, or it's written in a way, it's like the agency that's certified to receive these referrals, and that would be CACGA CSEC response team. And so we're definitely seeing, and I don't know that we don't have the child maltreatment report obviously from 2024. We won't for a couple of years there.
Yes.
Hopefully we'll get one in the future, but for that though, I would imagine there's still a gap there. And so I just want to always emphasize, like, even if a child, for example, is in foster care, that new referral needs to be made. If you're unsure, right. If you're like, well, could be, but maybe not. Maybe they're choosing to do this because you don't really understand.
Right.
Just make the referral, let the professionals do that assessment.
Right. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. And just to help you understand just how much work goes into supporting victims. And so Emma said earlier, about 12 to 14 is the average age of entry, or the average age of youth that we serve on our team. But we know about 2 years earlier is typically when those youth are experiencing CSEC. Our team was able to provide over 17,000 units of service total. 1,821 of those service units were focused on housing. That has exploded because our kids they need safe housing, right? But safe housing looks different for every kid. For some kids, that may be in a foster home. For some kids, we need to work to get them back home with their families if they are non-offending. For some kids, that may look like a group setting. And we have to have very hard conversations about that, which is why we're very careful about the language and the labels that we place on kids, because just because a child was exploited does not mean automatically that that child needs to go to a group home setting. That is the most severe. When we talk about a continuum of services and placement, group home settings is always going to be the most extreme intervention. Psychiatric residential treatment facilities, group homes, especially lockdown type group homes, are always going to be on the more extreme end of the continuum for intervention services. The best possible solution is keeping that child in their community as best as possible, but we know that's not always feasible. And so between CACGA, CSEC Clinic, and others, we're always having really hard conversations that are necessary about, is this group setting going to be appropriate or therapeutic or helpful to this child?
And just because a group setting says that it's therapeutic and says that it specializes in CSEC youth, does not mean that that is what is actually happening on the ground. I always tell my law students and attorneys working in this space, listen to your kids, and then investigate what they're telling you, because we have almost always found the things that they tell us to be true. Under the law, children have a right to be in the least restrictive, most family-like setting when they're in foster care. They also need to be in the most least restrictive setting if they have been committed to DJJ, for example, in order for them to benefit from rehabilitative services. And so in those instances, when we're looking at CSEC placements, Georgia doesn't have consistent or enforceable standards right now. So you can kind of call yourself a CSEC placement. It doesn't mean you're evidence-based, doing best practices, et cetera. That's not to say there are some fantastic ones out there.
Right.
And there are some really wonderful ones that I've seen clients really thrive in. But you need to listen to them. I've had clients experience further abuse, neglect, especially emotional abuse, not receiving culturally responsive care and services, being taunted by staff there. I mean, like all kinds of really terrible things that can occur in these settings. So just because it's labeled a certain way doesn't mean it's the best place for kids. And these are kids that need love and affection, and they need to learn how to trust supportive and safe caregivers. And it's really hard to do that in a group setting.
Yeah, absolutely. In addition to that, over 12,000 units of service for interagency collaboration. We don't do this in isolation. We have to work with partners to serve these youth. And it requires a lot of effort, a lot of meetings, so many phone calls, in-person, virtual meetings to just coordinate services, and then 2,890 units of service to ensure ongoing safety and well-being, because things shift. Sometimes a kid is in crisis, they stabilize, and then they are back in another crisis. And Emma will talk about stages of change in just a moment to help you understand that process.
I was born in Chile.
So the next video that we're going to watch is a video from a survivor leader. Her name is Ori Freeman. Ori does a lot of work across the country. She's a national speaker, author, and just does amazing work across the U.S. to support victims of exploitation and to just educate individuals who may not have the knowledge to support or just even understand issues.
I was born in Chowchilla State Prison. My mother was fighting murder at the time when she had me. At 2 days, I was adopted by a single mother who worked 3 jobs in order to provide for me. I had a very normal childhood in the very beginning up until the age of 8 when I was molested by a family friend. By the time I was about 9.5, 10 years old, I experienced a rape, and there was no justice that was ever served. I didn't receive any counseling. My mother never had a conversation with me about it. I think it was very hard for her. So it was all these feelings of like insecurity and feeling like I don't belong, guilt and shame and dirtiness was bottling up inside. I ended up running away and met a friend. We went to this house, which was like a drug house. She left me and said, I'll be right back. In that house was a male sitting on the couch right next to me. For the first time in my life, somebody asked me, was I okay? After the rapes, after the molestation, after all the bullying, somebody finally asked me, was I okay? I told that man my life story in 30 seconds. And he didn't have to come and look for me. Like, he didn't have to come hunt like how normal traffickers do. I fell right on his doorstep. I was a kid in need. I needed shelter. I needed clothes. I needed food. And I was going to need someone to take care of me because I was only 11 years old. And I just remember this look in his eye was just like this. I got her. And he started to groom me. And then that grooming process is he was preparing me to be trafficked. And I remember just freaking out in the back seat, like scared. He got out, was yelling, "Why are you crying?" And he hit me. "I want to just go home. I want to go home." And he was just like, "Where are you going to go? Nobody wants you." And I believed those lies. And he grabbed me by my hair and dragged me down the street. My knees were scraping the floor. It was other women out there. Nobody did anything. When you have been forced to sleep with 7 to 15 men and be raped and be 11 years old, I was like slowly dying. And after the first night, you suppress those feelings because any inch of hope that you have, any sense of I can get out, any feeling of there's a God, any feeling of I don't deserve this, you get beat. You ain't gonna survive out there. By the time I was 12 years old, within a year, I was already raped over 4,000 times. It took me to be 4.5 years in the life until I was 15 years old for someone to finally step up and do something.
So basically in the video, Ori is talking about her experience with trafficking and exploitation. She talks about sort of that just progression from being a child that whose parents were not necessarily involved in her early childhood to her being adopted, to her sort of being not necessarily supervised very well, to her then being exploited. She went to a friend's house. Her friend left her at that house with an older gentleman that he asked the right questions, gave her some attention, which she was lacking at that time in her life. And in under 10 minutes, she says this herself, she told that man, basically told him her entire life story. And he just kind of basically took that and was like, okay, I know exactly what to do from there. And that started the progression into the trafficking she experienced as a teenager. This started, I believe, at 10 or 11 years old. She was raped continuously, exploited, I think, up until young adulthood. And so at one point, there was a law enforcement officer who actually intervened and was the first person to really ask her, hey, what's going on with you? And that really was the first relationship with a safe adult during the turmoil and the exploitation that she established that eventually led to her healing journey and her getting the support and help that she needs. And so I really wanted to point that out because sometimes it's just one professional. And it doesn't matter if you have 5 minutes or 5 months with that young person. You can be the one professional that helps turn it all around or plants that seed that begins to bloom for that young person where they're able to trust again and accept help. And so we share here the continuum of sexual abuse in CSEC to just further elaborate on the fact that there is a correlation between childhood sexual abuse and commercial sexual exploitation. And a lot of times it starts with those violations of boundaries. Eventually the sexual abuse happens in that progression of that child viewing themselves as a sexual object, guilt and shame associated with what happened to them, especially if there isn't the proper services, therapeutic services in place, or just having a safe adult that can protect them. Low self-esteem, maybe leaving home without permission, linking love, sex, and abuse. And then that may morph into some exploitation, which can only be exacerbated by the fact that that child may have the need of poverty. There may be unequal power dynamics in a unsafe relationship with an adult. We have a $1 billion sex industry that honestly highlights children, unfortunately. And a lot of times there's media influences. Our kids like things, just like we like nice things. Our kids like nice things. And someone can come in and promise them these nice things, which can lead to that child being exploited because they just have basic needs. And wanting something nice is a basic need for any person. Like, they deserve to have those things too. So this isn't the full picture, but it just offers you a snapshot of how these things can progress for victims.
And her story really is a very typical story of what I hear. You know, I don't hear the being snatched in the night and stuff. That's not it. It's met him through a friend, live in my neighborhood, go to the same church, those types of things. That's what we're talking about. It's not someone hiding in the bushes. It's not someone.
It's not the white van. Right?
Yeah, it's not the white van. It's not any of that. And so it's really important, again, that the in speaking to kids, to really listen to what they're saying and how it occurred, and not just assume, oh, well, that can't be trafficking. That's not how that occurs.
Right.
Okay, sexual abuse of prison pipeline. So I mentioned Rights for Girls earlier. So they had teamed up with Georgetown Law School on a couple of different, several different reports on the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. And this is a quote from the updated report. The original report was a few years back from then. But the idea here is when you see that continuum we were just talking about, from sexual abuse to sexual exploitation. And then kind of went back to a statement made earlier about, we usually see kids being victims being arrested for various delinquency offenses or adult crimes, depending on their age and what the nature of it is. But sexual abuse can then, as a child, can then lead to various behaviors that are then criminalized. And, they're being difficult, they're not talking to us, they're angry, they're combative, they're not compliant, they're running away, they're not going to school, they have an attitude, all of these things. And one of the really significant pieces of the sexual abuse to prison pipeline studies has been that it is disproportionately impacting Black and brown girls, but not just girls, also boys, LGBTQ youth, and for us to, as professionals, look at our implicit biases. And I mean, everyone has them. I can say as much as I want. I'm not racist. I don't discriminate, but everyone has implicit biases. We were all socialized, in this world, somewhere in this world, and biases can creep in and you don't know it. So always question, why am I thinking about this child or this case in this certain way? Is some sort of a bias creeping in here that's keeping me from viewing this child as a child? There's a phenomenon referred to as adultification. We see in particular a lot of adultification of Black children, boys and girls, looking at them as if they're more adult-like, less likely to, to be innocent, more likely to be active participants in their own exploitation. And again, this is a product of bias and discrimination that is disproportionately seen within our child welfare and criminal justice and juvenile justice systems.
Right.
Thank
So
you for highlighting that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of times Emma mentioned the adultification, and then even just the criminalization of trauma, and us not asking the right questions to figure out why a youth has gotten to the point that they've gotten to, and not asking not why are you like this, but what happened to you, because oftentimes there is a story there, and the sexual abuse to prison pipeline helps to illustrate, hey, this didn't just happen. This kid didn't just wake up one day to, choose violence, as some would say. Yeah. There was a natural progression that got that child to where they are. We need to ask the right question.
We hear too often, oh, her. She's just going to do what she's going to do. She's going to run away. We can't do anything. She's going to do what she's going to do. That's adultifying a child. I mean, I hear professionals all the time talking that way about 13, 14, 12-year-olds.
Right.
It's, and every single time it's typically a Black child. So I want to point that out. My white clients get equine therapy. My Black kids get locked up in detention.
Yeah. Just have to sit with that for a minute.
Yeah.
And it is something that we have to pay attention to.
Name it, say it out loud.
Absolutely.
You have to name it and say it out loud. It's a pattern I've seen for years. And I think it's really important that we point it out and we face it, we confront it, and we think about why is that happening and what can we do in our own individual capacities to try to dismantle that sexual abuse to prison pipeline and the disproportionality in our system.
Absolutely. And these hard conversations have to happen to do that. They're not easy. And we have to have them even within our own team. Let's reframe that. Let's take a look at this from a different lens. And it does help our team kind of boil down what the true issue is. And so we wanted to just go over some vulnerabilities to help you understand. Emma mentioned earlier that any youth can be vulnerable to trafficking. So please don't let this list of vulnerabilities be the only thing that we're looking for. Just by nature of being a young person under the age of 18, you're at risk. Your gender can put you at risk. Your socioeconomic status can put you at risk. But these are some vulnerabilities that we know statistically put children at greater risk. Unmonitored and unrestricted access to the internet, which she mentioned earlier. Sometimes our youth already have friends, associates, parents, family members that are already being victimized or being trafficked, or if they're adults, they're already involved in the commercial sex industry, and that can put them at greater risk. It does not mean that those individuals will exploit them, because we also have to kill this narrative of if a child's parent is a sex worker or involved, consenting sex worker involved in commercial sex work, that they're going to traffic their kid. That is not the case. We don't want to criminalize consenting sex workers. And so we have to understand that doesn't necessarily mean that person is going to traffic their child. Youth with substance use or co-occurring disorders or LGBTQIA plus youth are often 7 times more likely to be groomed or approached by a trafficker, because oftentimes these youth are not being supported within their families or their communities. A history of sexual violence, being a young person, testing boundaries and taking risk. And sometimes as adults, we don't understand that is a natural part. Like, I know you all know that, but that is a natural part of adolescent development. And a risk doesn't always have to be unsafe. We can help guide youth towards safe risk that they can take. But if we don't have some type of risk that youth can safely engage in, they're going to find an outlet. Whether that's, okay, I could either go be in the school play or go do motorbike racing, or I can steal a car. You get to, as this safe adult, kind of help guide me in which direction I can go in. But our youth like to take risks, and we just have to be okay with that. Yes, ma'am.
What do you say in response to maybe a professor or a parent who say by empathizing with the fact that a youth will test boundaries or engage in unhealthy risky behavior is actually encouraging it?
Well, I'm just going to say, hey, what were you like as a teenager? Tell me, like, what were you really like when your parents weren't watching, when nobody was paying attention? I wouldn't say it like that. I would be much nicer about it. But I would ask, like, hey, let's think about, because I know I wasn't a super risk-taking teen, but I did push boundaries a lot, and I had a smart mouth. So all of that coupled, my parents caught it with me. So I have to think back to, what was I like? I like to be in control of things. I wanted to be the one to kind of be able to say what I would do, wouldn't want to do. And I look at our kids and I'm like, you know what? I can respect that because I was that. And so I think a lot of times it's like reflecting on, how were you as a young person? Like, really sit with that. And also, like, it's just, the evidence is there. Like, we know young people like to take risks. We know that they like to test boundaries. But that's a healthy part of
lots of peer-reviewed studies on this.
Yes.
A lot of research on this.
Yeah.
One of my favorite articles, and I'm blanking on the name of it, but or the author of it, and I'm sorry if I can send it if anyone's interested, but is likening the time of adolescence to having your learner's permit, right? If we don't teach adolescents how to drive, we are all going to be a lot less safe, right? And if we don't teach them how to drive, they're not going to be able to drive. So how do we do it in a way that is safer for them? I mean, it's still unsafe for them to be behind the wheel. Let's be honest. Right. We know that it is a lot less safe for them to be behind the wheel, but we recognize we need to let them learn in a safe environment as we can. It doesn't mean there aren't risks with it. It doesn't mean that once they're 16 and they can have that full driver's license, it's not very risky,
right? But
we let them do it, because if we don't, they won't learn how to be safe. They won't learn those new skills that they're going to need as adults. We have so many kids within the juvenile justice or child welfare system that they are not given the opportunity to engage in normal, typical adolescent risk-taking, right, or just life. And so, and they're unfortunately, especially when we're talking about kids who are victims of CSEC, more likely to be institutionalized. When we throw them out, and I mean throw them out into the real world when they're 18 or 21, depending, or in between, depending on when they leave those systems, they don't know how to open up a bank account. No. They don't know how to get transportation. They don't know how to cook their own meals and clean their own laundry and get an apartment. Let me go on and on and on with all of these things that we haven't taught them how to do. And we haven't allowed them to then also hone in their decision-making skills.
Right.
And if we don't let them test it, I mean, you're making it a lot less safe for not just them, but everyone.
It's tough.
It's hard.
Yeah. And I'm not saying, I don't think either of us are trying to say it's easy, and we empathize with especially parents and adults who are caregivers of these youth, because that's a chaotic time in that young person's life. But I encourage.
I'm not saying let them do whatever they want all the
Right.
time within appropriate developmental boundaries.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And leaning on other safe adults. Like I just being able to mentor or trust another adult to help mentor your child, so you're not the only safe adult or authority in your child's life. They have other people that you can trust, that child can also lean on. I think is paramount. Like I don't know if I would have been able to get through my young adult years or teenage years without other safe adults that my mom and my dad could trust. And so I think that's just as critical as well. Mm-hmm. So here we have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we only share this to illustrate that we all as humans have basic needs, right? Our youth, I think sometimes we forget that young people have basic needs that we as adults have as well. And so we share this because on a basic level, we all have physiological needs. We need air, water, food, sleep, clothing, all the things. And then as we go up, only when those physiological needs are met can we then move to concerning ourselves with other needs such as personal security, employment, resources. And then when that is met, then we can move to love and belongingness. And of course, we know these things intertwine with each other in very complicated ways. But just for today's presentation, we're sharing it in this very simplistic way and breaking it down here. And so the same way that we're able to identify our own personal needs and maybe even identify the needs of other people, traffickers are looking at these things as well. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes what they'll do is if they see a child who has basic physiological needs that are not being met, that child is a prime target for grooming and exploitation. Because they know it could be as simple as I can get this child a McDonald's Happy Meal because they haven't ate in 2 days, and now I have this child's full attention. I can do that consistently for a week. Now I have that child's loyalty. I can do that for another month. Now that child basically belongs to me. And so when we look at that those physiological needs not being met is a risk factor. However, on the other end, traffickers are not always just looking at, the kid who doesn't have any of their physiological needs met. What about self-actualization? The kid who maybe has all of these things, they come from a safe home, parents are involved, but this child wants to be a model or a rapper, or they want to just do something with their life that's exciting, and this person comes in and promises them the very thing that they've been working for a certain amount of time to achieve. And now this person is the answer to them being able to achieve that. And we've had kids get victimized because someone promised them something. This child came from a great family community. They had all their needs met, but now there's this promise of achieving a dream that they've had for a number of years. And this person is the answer to all of that. Yeah. That child's at risk as well.
When we have kids in foster care, for example, that love and belonging piece, you just put them in a group home, they're not getting that. No, they're not getting that. And so if someone comes in and it starts more like a dating relationship or a friendship or something like that, a mentorship, that love and belonging, you get it from someone who then is preying on you. Yeah. This quote that we have up too, I wanted to point it out because this is something that comes up a lot. I'll be sitting in a room with other professionals and we're talking about one of the kids I'm representing, and everyone's really mad because they're leaving without permission. And where are they getting this money to go get their hair and nails done? Why do they need their hair and nails done? And I just want to look around the room and say, okay, I want you to go a month. I want you to go 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, a year without getting your hair and nails done. I want you to come in here every single day into court without your makeup on. I want you to come in every single day and someone else chooses what clothes you wear. And they're not going to fit you well. Mm-hmm. They're going to be too small, too big.
Somebody else's clothes.
Too tight, someone else's clothes, all of that. And you know what? You know what I hate too? They don't need to get their hair done. They don't need to get their nails done. It makes them feel good. Mm-hmm. You know what they're going to do? They're going to go out and get it done somewhere else, and that makes them less safe. So just take a deep breath. Think about if you're in that situation and how your life would be. Right. And if we don't meet these needs as systems, traffickers are going to meet it.
Agreed. We have about 5 more minutes here, and so we'll just briefly skip some of this because I want Emma to be able to talk through stages of change, harm reduction, and you just tell me where to stop.
Well, stages of change is something that I've learned from you all, actually. So I don't know. You talk about stages of change, and I can do harm reduction.
I'll say this briefly. Stages of change is going to be paramount in any type of direct services because you cannot serve someone if you cannot meet them where they are. I had a goal of working out consistently at the beginning of this year. I've probably gone through every stage in this cycle. Now, if somebody would have walked up to me that did not have a relationship with me and be like, girl, you need to work out. You need to get your life together because you walking upstairs and you can barely catch your breath. I will have a problem with that. That person is not meeting me where I am. I don't know them, but if someone that I trust and love and know walked up to me and said, hey, Naeisha, like, we need to talk about your athletic life. Like, look, what are we doing here?
Even then, I might double down and be like, I'm going to get a cheeseburger.
Exactly.
You go to the gym by yourself.
And then we can go walk together. But at that point, maybe I can start to think about change. But that person still has to meet me where I am because maybe I'm not open to working out at that time. But maybe they're asking me open-ended questions about, hey, so like, how do you feel about not being able to get up a flight of stairs without passing out? Like, what are your thoughts about that? And we can have a conversation and work through that cycle. But the biggest thing about stages of change that we need all of you to realize is you cannot get to harm reduction and start talking about harm reduction if you don't understand where that child is on that stage of change continuum in terms of wanting to even change. Is that kid even aware that the thing that's happening that they're experiencing or their behavior is a problem?
Yeah. And I can't force them to the next stage. I can't force someone that can barely get up a flight of stairs to then go to CrossFit every single day.
No, absolutely.
That would be insane.
And I tried that and I almost died.
Yeah.
So like, I
was
was
very
very suggested.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat. Casey wants to know, what are some key indicators or behaviors that may suggest a parent or guardian is involved in the sex trafficking of their child or themselves, and how can educators, school social workers effectively identify it?
Great question.
That was a great question.
I would say some of the red flags that we notice are the child is there. There's a lot of times there's some neglect challenges there. And even when resources are being offered to the family, they're not necessarily being taken. I will say another one is the child is constantly being, there's constant suspicions of sexual abuse or sexual violence in the child's home. So it could be this child like we've seen it, the child is always coming for a forensic interview for sexual abuse. The child is always going to the hospital because there's been another sexual assault. And parents in the child's life, but they're constantly bringing them like, I don't know what happened. And maybe there's some exposure happening in the home that it hasn't been addressed, or the parent is pretending that they don't know that the child is being exposed to a predator or something like that.
And family facilitated CSEC tend to be younger youth, although they can be older.
Yes.
And like Naeisha mentioned, those needs like poverty. I mean, it's sadly a way to pay rent. Right. It's sadly a way to get drugs.
Yeah.
And so that's typically what we are more likely to see with family facilitated CSEC. With older youth, though, that may not necessarily be the case.
Unless they're different.
Yeah, and there's a difference between like neglect and, maybe not. You'll always hear inadequate supervision, and so it's more maybe on the neglect side, not sort of an intentional facilitating the trafficking, but maybe knowing some of those things are happening. Sometimes the parents don't understand that it's trafficking. They don't understand that it's CSEC, and they might say, I don't know, they don't listen to me. They go out, they have those boyfriends, they're out there having sex. I tell them not to. They don't listen to me.
But they bring me money at the end of each week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they help pay the rent and whatever else. And so it's not necessarily an intentional thing that they're doing. They may not understand that their child can't consent to those things. But just briefly for the last, I know we're at noon, but wanted to mention harm reduction. It's a really important piece of all of this. I like to think of harm reduction as making kids safer, not the safest that they can possibly be. And so when we are using harm reduction, we can use it in a lot of different areas. It goes very well with a trauma-informed approach. We can use it with safety planning. So an example that I know I talk a lot with a lot of other folks about is, this question of, but if we give the kid condoms, then they'll have sex. Well, they're already having sex.
Right.
So what's going to make them safer? Access to condoms or no access to condoms? Knowing how to have the conversation with a partner about using a condom or not knowing how to approach that conversation? I want them to be safer. Am I super comfortable with it? Not necessarily. Is this evidence-based? Yes. And so we really need to think about those different strategies. And so again, we can use harm reduction, like Naeisha mentioned, if we are meeting the kid where they are. So maybe we're past a certain point, and they're willing to maybe engage in a little bit more services, and they're in this action mode. Then maybe we might be able to put in some more supports and interventions and safety planning that then as adults makes us feel like they're safer. But an important piece of this too is the kid needs to feel safe.
Yes.
I don't define their safety for them. They define their own safety. And you know, it may just be, hey, I need to make sure, let's go to the next slide. I just need to make sure that they have ways to be safer. Do they have numbers of safe adults they can call? Mm-hmm. This is one thing I hear a lot. Oh, we can't have them have their cell phone. They're going online. They're doing all this stuff on social media. They're going to go out and they're going to find another cell phone somehow. Mm-hmm. Okay. And that means they might be exploited in order to get that cell phone. Kids live on their phones. Again, we can't lock them away in a cell forever in an art cave where they're not exposed to the real world. How do we make them safer? So I think that probably concludes this, unless there's anything else Naeisha wants to say. She's amazing. Her team has taught me so much in all of this.
I appreciate that. No, I think the biggest thing is it's a lot. This is a lot for anyone. We do this every day. Emma does this every day. But for those of you who are interested in engaging with or serving survivors of any type of violence, especially sexual violence or CSEC, we encourage you to, and we can send out a list of resources, but studying up on stages of change, studying up on harm reduction. I know that was a primarily used in the substance use community, but we are applying it very heavily in the CSEC
nationwide
violence community.
Nationwide. Yeah. California has some great resources for caregivers, court professionals. They're really wonderful. We can give links to those.
Yeah. So we just encourage you to definitely reach out if you have questions. We can send a link to these resources as well. And then if you suspect that you encounter a victim of trafficking, or if you just want more information, you can reach out to our team. We also have the statewide hotline, which is 1-866-END-HTGA. And that's the statewide hotline, not only for child youth victims, but for adult victims as well. It's a phone tree that has access to an array of resources across the state for foreign national victims, adult victims, and child victims. So there are resources available, and we try to make it easy to access by centralizing them to one hotline. Thank you all so much for this.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate it.